You characterized the higher carbohydrate diet as genocide, I think was your words. Noakes has characterized mainstream dietary advice as genocide. Pretty strong words.
I am at MIT's Media Lab today because I just gave a TEDx talk to a packed audience. I have a lopsided beard today. This is forest on the left and farmland on the right. And I even cracked a joke about desertification, deserts where nothing grows. The beard was to represent our forests because we've converted almost half of them globally to farmland. And that is driven primarily by the food we eat. My previous episode on YouTube was about Dr. Bickman's claim that you can thrive on a carnivore diet, but it's impossible as a vegan. Reading his book and listening to his talks really helped me understand the comments I'm receiving on my channel. When a scientist and university professor speaks with such great confidence, it's understandable that many thousands of people will embrace his ideas and share them passionately on social media. The dilemma we all face, though, is there are university scientists whose ideas completely oppose each other. How do mere mortals like us make sense of that? One of the comments from that episode was from Darkfield Carnivore, who wrote, "I challenge you to attempt to discredit Tim Noakes and Gary Fetke." That caught my attention because I've had high regard for South African professor Tim Noakes for maybe 30 years. I have loved Ironman and ultra running races, and his Lore of Running book is a classic. Amazon tells me I bought a newer edition of it in 2007, the year I ran South Africa's 56-mile Comrades Marathon. A very experienced runner collapsed right in front of me near the finish line of that race, and the paramedics who were right there couldn't save him, one of 2 runners to die that year. Dr. Noakes wrote papers and a book about it, which I found very persuasive. In those days, my 3 go-to experts were Dave Scott, the 6-time Ironman world champion who said he ate a plant-dominant diet with some fish, Scott Jurek, the 7-time Western States 100 champion who eats a purely vegan diet, and Dr. Noakes, who advised a high-carb diet in his book, The Lore of Running. But something abruptly changed with Dr. Noakes.
I was promoting a high-carbohydrate, low-fat diet for 33 years, and then I fortunately came across the new Atkins for a New You. I purchased the book, and within 3 hours I realized that I'd been wrong for 33 years, and I decided to change.
Not only that, but I checked in with Dave Scott, who I've raced against twice because he's in my age group.
So I want to just talk about one topic that really affects skin health, and that's the high intake of polyunsaturated fats.
And he has gone the way of Dr. Noakes, recommending a keto diet, low in polyunsaturated fat, high in saturates.
I think about eliminating these polyunsaturated fats and going to saturated fats. And the saturated fats, coconut oil is always on my A list. Butter, lard, ghee, sour cream, those are all on the A1 list. And get rid of the other ones that I've just talked about.
That's 2 out of 3 endurance experts I really respect. Better check this out. Dr. Noakes has written a lot of books on nutrition since his change of mind, promoting high-fat, high-animal foods and low carbs. My first stop was his talk on the cholesterol hypothesis. Part 1 alone is 3 hours and got 826,000 views.
And then I decided, well, there were 20 stories that the diet dictators who prosecuted me didn't want you to know. And I'm not going to go through all 20, but I'm going to choose the top 10.
Boy, that sounded conspiratorial. Most scientists don't talk that way. But Tim is a smart guy and has researched this exhaustively, so I'll try to shake it off and keep an open mind. Who can give a 3-hour lecture and get nearly 1 million views?
Number 1 will shock everyone, I think. The claim I make here is that the true cause of atherosclerosis or coronary heart disease is unknown. So how can anyone make that suggestion? Well, the answer comes to me after reading these 2 articles by Stephens and some of his other work.
I didn't know who William Stephens was. These papers are from the early 90s and were behind paywalls, so a few yellow flags were popping up in my head. First, I didn't know how many of the 826,000 viewers of this talk would purchase access to these papers and study them like I did. Second, Stephens acknowledges financial support from New Zealand's National Heart Foundation, cool, the New Zealand Dairy Board, uh-oh, and the New Zealand Meat Producers Board, double uh-oh. Marion Nessel told me that after writing so many books on how industry funds nutrition research, she can usually tell from the first few lines of a paper who funded it. Industry-funded papers are usually written to cast doubt on science and create confusion, and these 2 papers are written in exactly that way.
And he says the problem is the epidemiologists have misled us because they've confused cause and reasons.
Whatever, these 2 papers deal with one of life's most fascinating and important topics, causation, We all deal with that every single day. Why did my car not start? Why is my son struggling with math? Why do I have pain in my stomach? I get asked all the time to recommend books that I love, but I've never found one compelling enough about causation to recommend, even though I would love to. But that changed this year when I found Steven Pinker's book, Rationality, which has a great chapter on causation. I'm here on Harvard's campus where he's a professor, and I wish I'd thought ahead and asked if we could meet so I could interview him, but I'm an idiot and I didn't. Gah!
But the real point is that if you remove the cause, the disease disappears. So if you think you are treating the cause and the disease doesn't disappear, then you're not treating the cause.
That's a definition of cause I hadn't heard before. So we think smoking is a cause of lung cancer, and if we stop smoking, lung cancer goes away? Type 2 diabetes and heart disease can at least be partially reversed if they haven't progressed too far. But what about type 1 diabetes? Alzheimer's disease? What about skin damage from a lifetime in the sun? One of the things that was bothering me about these papers is they're more than 20 years old, and there have been some amazing breakthroughs over the last 20 years. One breakthrough is the advent of Mendelian randomization studies. So you know what randomized control trials are. The big confounding factor with randomized control trials is how short-term they are relative to the time it takes to form chronic diseases. If you did a randomized control trial of smoking, you'd probably conclude that it was healthy, because in the time frame of a randomized control trial, you'd find that you'd lose weight, you'd relax, be happy. It isn't until about 20 years that you see the negative effects of smoking begin to appear. Longer-term studies like the famous Harvard Nurses' Health Study have confounding factors too, which have been endlessly talked about, but they are the kind of study which eventually unraveled the long-term unhealthy effects of smoking. Enter genetic studies, where scientists can see the genes you were dealt with at birth. Those will never change in your lifetime. One of Gregor Mendel's laws of genetics is you were randomly assigned genes from both your dad and your mom at conception. And we know which assortment of genes predisposes you to high LDL cholesterol. I pretty much have all of them. Bummer. And then it becomes a pretty cost-effective and accurate study to determine who got the high LDL-causing genes and who gets heart disease. Many confounders removed, and the big bonus is it can reflect all the junk food you ate as a kid. You know you did.
We've assembled this distinguished panel of experts to test a brand new breakfast cereal, Dinky Donuts.
They certainly look like little donuts.
Because these studies begin at conception. And if you take all the rigorous studies, including the ones of the last few decades, you get this stunning chart. The red dots you see are from randomized control trials, 27 of them, medium follow-up 5 years. The gray dots are for more long-term observational trials, 8 of them. And the light blue dots are the newer Mendelian randomization studies, 14 of them with median follow-up the equivalent of 52 years. What? Too bad we had to wait until the early 2000s for the Human Genome Project to complete and make these studies possible. For randomized trials, the horizontal scale means how much LDL was reduced by administering a statin. The scale is in European units. In American, that 2.0 on the far right would read 77 units of LDL reduction. And what you see is lowering LDL in all the trials reduced the risk of coronary disease, and it didn't matter whether the participants already had heart disease or not. They all had the same reduction in risk. For the Mendelian randomization, it was how much your collection of genes kept your cholesterol low. Like my 93-year-old father-in-law who can eat anything and his LDL stays low and arteries clear. But if you got lucky with your genes, you can post on social media that you eat lots of saturated fat and your LDL stays low. Proof that the concern about saturated fat is bunk and everyone should eat like you do.
I know what you're thinking. You've got to ask yourself one question. Do I feel lucky? Well, do you, punk?
In the meantime, a very long list of respected scientists took this data to mean LDL is causal in heart disease.
This is a key point. Reduction in incidence rather than elimination of the disease precludes a causal relationship. So if you think you're treating the cause, but all that happens is the incidence of the disease reduces, but does not disappear, you haven't found the cause.
Keep in mind that Dr. Noakes is quoting 30-year-old papers before Mendelian randomization was even an idea. But it raises good questions. The first is whether LDL is the only causal factor. The lead author of the paper where I got this stunning graph, Brian Ference, had something to say about that.
So numerous randomized trials have demonstrated that lowering LDL and lowering systolic blood pressure each reduce the risk of cardiovascular events. And what we found is that the combination of exposure to both lower LDL and lower systolic blood pressure have independent, additive, and dose-dependent effects on the lifetime risk of cardiovascular disease. So that, for example, just 0.3 millimoles lower LDL and 5 millimeters of mercury lower systolic blood pressure was associated with a 50% lower lifetime risk of cardiovascular disease. These are the kinds of decreases that can be achieved with commonly prescribed diets like the DASH diet.
The second question is, why are statins less effective than good genes if they achieve the same level of LDL? Dr. Ference's hypothesis is good genes protect you from birth, whereas statins usually enter the picture late when plaque is already built up. Another author on the paper, Ronald Krauss, believes statins are only partially effective in sweeping away the most harmful LDL particles.
Statins would have a lesser effect on smaller LDL particles because they're more dependent on receptor-mediated uptake. And in fact, we've shown that.
But does he believe statins are not at least partially effective?
Having said that, there is absolutely no doubt that the LDL-lowering effect of statins contributes to reduced heart disease risk. I think that's unquestionable.
Dr. Noakes is super active on Twitter and often posts that LDL is not causal. So I tweeted in one of his threads that I can see how this could be controversial in the past, but it's hard to understand now in the age of so many high-quality studies, including the addition of Mendelian randomization studies which remove even more uncertainty. He responded, probably best place to put this graph in the context of all the evidence are those who challenged the lipid hypothesis. And then he called out to a number of people, including Dr. Asim Malhotra. But no one responded, and I don't know what the response would be other than to attack Mendelian randomization studies, and that seems like a very hard thing to do successfully. But Chris, you say, they've made tons of videos about cholesterol that got millions of views. How could you miss them? It's true. Stan Ekberg made an episode saying your doctor is wrong, 1 million views. Ken Berry on statin deception, 500,000 views. Mark Hyman, cholesterol is not the cause, 500,000 views. Dr. Noakes frequently retweets Ken Berry, so let's see what he has to say.
The cell membrane of every single cell in your body has cholesterol in the membrane. The membrane will not function if you don't have cholesterol. So how does it make any sense that this thing that's absolutely vital for life for the last 100,000 years, now magically, once Lipitor and Zocor on the market, is really bad for you and you should try to lower it and not eat any of it at all? You see the illogic nature of that? There's no common sense in that at all.
Let's think about that. Fat is essential too, but lately the body's been making way too much of it and putting it in all the wrong places like our livers. Why would the body do that?
Your body actually makes 3,000 milligrams of cholesterol every day. Why would your body do that?
Second, we're not talking about cholesterol in cell membranes. We're talking about the body putting it in our arteries. Let's see if Dr. Berry can give us a masterclass on going viral by hitting the most viral themes. Anger.
We were tricked by some early research done on cholesterol and saturated fat. And then, of course, the big drug companies picked that up and ran with that because they sniffed billions of dollars in the air. They made the doctors look like buffoons.
Fear.
If I were able to magically reach through your screen and grab all your cholesterol out of your body right now, do you know what would happen? You would die within minutes.
Surprise?
There's almost no research that shows that your LDL level is meaningfully related to your risk of heart attack and stroke.
Conspiracy?
Only after we lowered everyone's cholesterol with the statin drugs did we start having an Alzheimer's epidemic. I'm not saying it caused it. I'm saying it sure does look related, don't you think?
Sharing.
If you've got a friend or your dad or mom or your uncle or your cousin or your next door neighbor's been worried to death about their cholesterol, please share this video with them so they can take a breath and relax.
Happiness.
The take-home message is stop worrying about your total cholesterol. It is meaningless.
Ugh, I hate saying this. I'd so much rather talk about my granddaughter Caitlin's new puppy. But that so reminds me of the televangelist who got most of my grandma's retirement. Similar techniques, different context. Ugh. In order to make great scientific advances like Mendelian randomization, it takes hard work and very deep understanding of genetics, biochemistry, study design, big data, etc. Tragically, the scientists who do it don't have time for social media, and they don't like to exploit those viral tricks. So we're getting our info from people who aren't doing science, they're doing social media, and they really know how to go viral. While I was on Twitter, I read through Dr. Noakes' stream. He had recently been banned for misinformation on his main account. He retweeted a lot about vaccines, Jeffrey Epstein's death, and the one that apparently got him banned was promoting the idea that European leaders didn't actually get the COVID vaccine. They faked it with saline solutions because they knew the vaccine was harmful. He also talked about things like ivermectin in his interviews.
You're not allowed to prescribe ivermectin in South Africa. Well, who says that a doctor can't prescribe a medication? That's unbelievable.
So I thought, okay, he has clearly gone down the conspiracy theory path. I don't know what would cause a scientist I admired for so long to go down that path, but I guess there can be many reasons. But I will always be grateful for whoever recommended David McCraney's book to me, How Minds Change. What a wonderful book. So, true confession, when I saw Tim's retweets, like 20 a day of terrible conspiracy theorists, I thought, you know what, maybe I should drop this episode, and so I put it on pause. But what brought me back to it is curiosity about the size of his audience and the audience of people he's retweeting. Ken Berry, Asim Malhotra, and so they're very influential in health science. So I said doing the episode on Dr. Bickman helped me understand many of the comments on my channel, and this one is doing the same thing. For example, here's a common comment I get about Ancel Keys. Swanee said, the 7-country study is one of the most cherry-picked, distorted, and debunked studies in the history of nutrition. Having read so many of Dr. Keys' studies and coming away with the impression that he was the best we've ever had in nutrition science, I asked Marion Nessel about him.
To me, Ancel Keys is a great hero. He was an extraordinary researcher who did first-rate work in a number of fields. The 7-country study was only one of the many things that he did. He also was an expert on high-altitude physiology. He did a study of starvation during the Second World War that is the most amazing thing I've ever seen. Nobody's ever gone anywhere near it in terms of its level of detail, quality. The findings from it still hold up extremely well. You know, I once asked the question, why wasn't he Nobel Prize winning? Why wasn't he extolled with, fantastic awards and honors? We're still talking about the Mediterranean diet, and that was his construct.
So where are the negative comments about Keys coming from?
And I wrote 11 columns on insulin resistance, and then that led me into Ancel Keys and his cholesterol con, and I've just completed the 14 parts to that.
Those articles are hosted on CrossFit's site under the banner of scientific misconduct and mixed with articles about why scientists cheat and pathological science, whatever that is. Tim's subtitle is The Greatest Scam in Medical History. One of his primary sources is the journalist Nina Teicholz, author of The Big Fat Surprise. She's had this to say about Keys.
Keys did a lot of, there's hardly a better word for it than kind of saying fudging the data. And he published it in obscure German-only journals. I had to go back to obscure places. He really didn't want this data to get out.
What she's referring to is the 7-country study that Keys organized in 1958 and ran until 1975 when he retired. Henry Blackburn took over from there and saw it through its 50-year anniversary. I correspond with Henry often. He's still razor sharp and writing at 97. I've never seen Nina back up her claim that Keys faked data, and I scoured Tim's very long essays and couldn't find it there either. How dozens of scientists involved in the study from around the world and in independent institutions could be persuaded to fake their data in the 700 publications they made, many of them after Keys retired and his death, and kept it a secret for the last 50 years. I don't know how to rank conspiracy theories, but it seems to me that's near the level of NASA faked the moon landing, especially considering how many modern studies confirm all that data they faked over 50 years. Tim does reference some scientists who pushed back hard on Keys in the day. One was Dr. George Mann, who famously published a book about it in 1993, and this opinion piece in the New England Journal of Medicine, Diet Heart, End of an Era, in 1978. That title didn't age too well. The world is still talking about Diet Heart. George had the belief that diet didn't matter, but exercise did. He had studied populations like the Maasai and noted how active they were. George used a lot of conspiratorial language, and I wondered if that attracted Tim and Nina. In that New England Journal article, he wrote, "Soon the committee men were falling in line. This scientific issue was settled by majority votes. Galileo would have flinched. The dietary dogma was a moneymaker for segments of the food industry, a fundraiser for the Heart Association, and busy work for thousands of fat chemists." He looked at data from the 7-country study and noticed some people who exercised less had more heart attacks, which reinforced his thinking. I asked Henry about that because he knew George really well and they engaged in many debates together. Henry sent me this letter from Keys to the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine about George's paper. Mann misrepresents data from the 7-country study and states Keys's 7-country study indicates quite clearly that exercise protects in those populations. But the data he refers to simply illustrate the not surprising fact that men who have suffered a myocardial infarction often tend to avoid heavy physical labor. I know that tendency well because when my father got heart disease, I always had to mow the lawn because he said it would strain his heart. It should be remarked, of course, that even if it should be proved that physical inactivity contributes to the risk of developing coronary heart disease, that would not indicate that diet is unimportant. The idea of single causation for coronary heart disease belongs to the Dark Ages and was never espoused by me. Among recognized risk factors, age, sex, and blood pressure may be more important than the diet, but heredity, smoking, habitual exercise, diabetes, various metabolic peculiarities, and even personality also need research and public health attention. That's the thing about actually reading what Keys wrote. You come away saying, wow, that stood the test of time. Not much of what Dr. Mann wrote aged well. Even his propensity to study small remote populations like the Maasai and Inuit didn't age well, because modern genetic studies have revealed them to not be like the broader world population. Inuits have a genetic mutation, for example, that keeps them from going into ketosis, possibly evolution's way of protecting them against long-term health effects of ketosis. Dr. Noakes wrote a very large book that I tried to read, Real Food on Trial: How the Diet Dictators Tried to Destroy a Top Scientist. In the book, he is the top scientist and the victim. I couldn't get over the irony of him writing an 11-part series trying to destroy the legacy of Ancel Keys and accusing him of some pretty nasty conspiracies. What actually happened to Dr. Noakes is doctors and nutritionists didn't want him recommending weaning children on a high saturated fat, low-carb diet as he was doing. It was similar to their effort to curb prescribing ivermectin in South Africa for curing COVID-19, which apparently was widespread. Dr. Noakes refused and went to trial, and he and Nina turned it into a big conspiratorial spectacle that helped make him famous in South Africa. Tim and Nina did exactly what you would expect them to do: overwhelm the jury with days of testimony from old, obscure conspiratorial references.
12 days. I spoke for 9 days, and including 3.5 days of cross-examination. And then 3 expert witnesses, Nina Teicholz, who you know very well, Zoe Harcom, who you'll also know well from Wales, and Karen Zinn, who's a South African dietitian working in New Zealand. They spoke for another 3 days. So we had 12 days of testimony.
The resulting book has chapters with titles like The Worst Mistake in the History of Medicine, and it placed the blame for the global obesity crisis on the American Dietary Guidelines of 1977. So the good people of countries who've never heard of our guidelines from decades ago are gaining weight because of it, and that's the world's biggest medical scandal? Do I really need to comment on that? So what are my conclusions from this episode? Bad news first, and then the good. Number 1, what a tragic waste of a good mind it is to spend your time obsessing over old conspiracy theories. Think of the good Tim could do by focusing on modern scientific advances. Number 2, how exciting is it that the last 20 years have brought things like MRI scans of our organs and DNA analysis into modern studies to resolve causality. Number 3, Ancel Keys' and Henry Blackburn's Mediterranean diet, low in saturated fat, high in unrefined plants, has really stood the test of time. That's why every country's guidelines follow that pattern. It's not a conspiracy, it's not genocide, it's good science.
I got to go to TEDx with Chris, and it was awesome. One of the highlights was spending time with our favorite astronaut, Don Pettit. We did a short film about him a few years ago.
Looking at Earth from space is amazingly beautiful. It's a perspective where you can see things on the length scale of half a continent.
Oh, the only bad thing was I froze when Chris was filming at Harvard. It was a really cold day.